Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our State of the Program series. Tonight we have Ben McCollum and the Iowa Hawkeyes. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and I've got Joe Meade with me. If you have not seen these before, please check them out. Basically, the most of it is a season recap of the previous season for the given team, and then at the end we will give a little bit of our take on what the future holds, the state of the program, and if they are set up for success going forward. We're recording these, well in advance, so in terms of personnel, we don't exactly know everything when it comes to that, but we can take a guess in terms of the resources that they have. So, Joe, Iowa finishes the season 24-13. They get a 9 seed. They go on an Elite 8 run. They finish 10-10 in the conference. Ben McCollum, big storyline coming in. He had 1 year of Division I coaching experience at Drake. They won 30 plus games. Before that, he was the coach at Northwest Missouri State for a long time, won 3 Division II national titles. Safe to say this guy knows how to win.
Yeah, the guy's a winner, and I think a lot of people coming in projected Iowa to improve. I don't think it would be to the extent where they ended up getting into the tournament, but kind of was given the Kurt Cignetti label by some, not by a lot, even before the year. His track record at all those schools spoke for themselves. But one thing, Shaw, that we talked about, or even early on once he got hired, is man, what a change of pace between the fighting Fran McCaffreys versus the fighting Ben McCollums. I mean, talk about polar opposites. That was one thing we were very intrigued to see how it was going to work out. And, obviously, as we'll get into, we'll kind of explain the trajectory of their season. It was very complicated in spite of the great result. And we'll explain that kind of later.
Yeah, I believe before the season, Joe, I said I think Iowa's going to be the last team in the tournament in the Big Ten or the first team out. And I don't know exactly how it broke, but I believe they were the last team in the lowest seeded Big Ten team.
Yep.
Because Indiana fell out and Ohio State had jumped up to an 8, UCLA was a 7, USC was out. So yeah, I thought they were going to be right on the cut line, and their McCullum ball continued to work in the Big Ten, at least to an extent. Look, they had won like 95% of their games the last 13 years. Ben McCollum's teams, obviously, that didn't continue, but going 500 in this Big Ten, Joe, which did have the national champions, which had another team that made the Final Four, that is incredibly a really good accomplishment. And as we take a look at the game log here, I thought that they had a pretty easy start of the season schedule wise. Like they played a couple of power conference games against Xavier and Ole Miss, were able to win those rather easily. They beat a Grand Canyon team, which was in the top 55 in the net. So they go into East Lansing at 7-0. They get humbled a little bit. They lose by 19. If I remember correctly, Joe, I think that one was over pretty quickly. So at that point, it looked like maybe Iowa just knew the non-conference game and that the Big Ten game would be tough. And that was a little bit of an awakening for them because they did not play like that very often the rest of the way.
Well, yeah, Sean. And what's interesting is, you look at the schedule initially, right? Ole Miss is coming off a Sweet 16. Grand Canyon's one of the more respected programs. Then Xavier, I know it was the first year under Richard, but
Yeah,
you know that's
they killed Xavier that game.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
1.5 marquee non-con games before I called it their marquee week, which was going to the Breslin and then also going to Iowa State. I know they had Maryland sandwiched in between there, but the one thing I was impressed with Sean right after that, I'd call it a thorough dismantling. Not thorough, maybe a gradual dismantling is probably the phrase I was looking for. They smoked Maryland, who at that point was still decent enough. Like Pharrell Payne was healthy. They didn't really pack it in. Maryland, we'll talk about them later on another video. They really packed it in after January. I think that's very safe to say. So they beat a Maryland at full strength, and then they go to Ames and give Iowa State a really good matchup. They only lose that game by 4. And people were kind of wondering, all right, Iowa, probably not a top 15 team like they were ranked at times, especially early on in the year, but definitely a team that could comfortably get into this NCAA tournament, maybe even as a 6 to an 8 seed. So I think that opened some eyeballs. Then they cruised through the rest of non-con, but January shot didn't necessarily start so well for them after that home win against UCLA.
Yeah, they got barned. which happened a few different times to teams that went to play Minnesota this year. Again, Joe, I think Minnesota had, by the end of the season, they had 5 players. They had a few more. They had like 8 in this game.
Yeah.
They lose on a uh, late Cade Tyson shot, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
And then, look, they play Illinois and Purdue. They don't get blown out, but they were not ever really in position to win the game. They were sort of a play away from being a play away. So they go to Assembly Hall at 12-5, Joe. And at this point, this would have been the marquee win for either one of these teams that were both sitting in. They just own Indiana. They beat them by 17. They take the life out of that crowd. That was the day after one of the football playoff games, if I'm not mistaken, or 2 days after. Um, so Indiana was ready. The crowd was ready for that one. They took them right out. Then they got on a roll. They end up at 12. They were at 12-5. Then they get to 18-5. Not beating a single tournament team, but they took care of business with 3 road wins, 2 of which were quad one, and then they beat some of the teams at the bottom end of the conference too. But at 18-5, Joe, they seem to have a pretty other than the Minnesota game, they were losing to the teams that were above them, and they were beating the teams below them.
Yeah, that was my main critique of Iowa come February. I thought clearly McCollum had done a hell of a job, and they were safely in the tournament at that point just because the bubble, as we've talked about repeatedly throughout the year, was so terrible. But there was nothing that really screamed threat to me, especially in the Big Ten tournament, because I was viewing Iowa mainly as a conference threat as opposed to a national threat, which clearly is not a good take that aged. But they do get that win against Nebraska, very notably. They rushed the court. I think that's probably their marquee win of the year up to that point. It definitely is. Probably up to the NCAA tournament, to be quite real with you, Sean. They were close a bunch of times, and that's the thing I want to mention. Close against Iowa State. Away at Purdue, they were actually closer than when Purdue came to Carver Hawkeye. Purdue, that was probably one of Purdue's best games of the year. We'll talk about that on their season recap.
That was just a bad
Purdue,
time to play Purdue because that's when they were
yeah.
rolling before they skidded and then they were rolling again. But yeah, they go from 18-5, Joe. In that stretch, the 2 wins that they had were nice against Nebraska and Ohio State, but they were 2-7, 2-6 in their last 8 games going into the Big Ten tournament. So that was when, if you remember, to the viewers, we did like the bracketology show in that time period. And Joe, you said like, "What's up with Iowa here?" And I said, "Look, like all of a sudden their resume is not so great. Their numbers still say they should be clear of the bubble, but they don't have um, a win over like a real tournament team until they beat Nebraska. Then they back it up with an Ohio State win, who Ohio State were like won pretty much every game after that. I think in the regular season, then they
Mhm.
beat them in the tournament. So that wasn't that win aged better, but all of a sudden they were 20-11, 10-10. It's like, wow, like this team was 8-4 in the Big Ten, and maybe the schedule got a little tougher, and not maybe it did get tougher, but they were not winning when they went into Chicago.
Yeah, and probably the worst of all, Sean, losing to Michigan at home and losing the return matchup to Nebraska is all well. That's fine. But they lost to 2 of the bottom dwellers, man. They
Yeah,
lost at Purdue, I mean, sorry, at Penn State and at Maryland, to kind of sandwich that little skid they were in from the middle of February to really, March. And I'm gonna be honest, Sean, going into the Big Ten tournament, I didn't think there was a colder team, quite frankly, than Iowa. I know Purdue was talked about as cold, but Purdue, we still trusted that core between Kaufman, Wren, Fletcher, and Braden Smith. So they beat Maryland in a pretty underwhelming game, and then
that was a
I
good
thought they
game for
played.
them, Joe. I think because Maryland had to play the day
Eh,
before. Though I just say to not the fact that they performed great, but they got a victory under their belt.
mhm.
Because if they were the 8th seed, for example, and Ohio State had to play Maryland, they would have gone in to the big. They would have gone in winning 2 of their last 9, or 2 of their last 9. So, look, you get the victory against Maryland. You right a wrong that happened about a month, not about exactly a month earlier. And look, you played a great Ohio State team, but at that point, at 21-12, I don't think either of us were all that excited for watching Iowa in the tournament. Obviously, it was going to be matchup dependent, but I don't think at this point I wasn't going to pick them to win their first round game. Now they do get put alongside Clemson, who's a very similar team to them. We said it was a good matchup. We thought they'd win, and they jumped on that good draw and they rattled off three big wins. But that Clemson game was a good draw. We saw that coming, honestly, and then they were able to pull off the upset with Florida. But I think this team had a really solid season, Joe, but I didn't think anybody saw this coming going into March Madness.
No, I thought they were the coldest team in the tournament from the Big Ten. And I would have said that about Purdue had they not just steamrolled their way to a Big Ten tournament title. So it was pretty clear that, man, you know, I was cold as ever. And I thought, getting past Clemson, getting that NCAA tournament win, I don't think they had one. I think their last one prior to this year was 2021, the COVID year with Luka
With yep,
Garza.
yep.
So, getting that I thought was huge for them. But then, probably the upset of the tournament, to be quite honest with you, Sean, comes against the defending national champs in Florida. And talk about, I know Florida did win the SEC tournament. Talk about coldest team
No,
in the
they
tournament to
no, they
one of the
didn't.
hottest teams going in.
Arkansas won the SEC tournament.
No, I'm saying I know they did win the SEC
Oh,
tournament,
didn't.
Florida.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
Yep, yep.
I know they did win the SEC tournament, but if there were a team that didn't win their conference tournament, that was probably the hottest team from when
Yeah.
they lost at home to Auburn to the actual tournament itself. It had to be the Florida
Yeah,
Gators.
they were rolling over the SEC in that stretch, like you said, which was a lot. I think like 12 games, maybe. Um,
Yeah,
and they were like SEC didn't have any great teams this year except for Florida, but they were crushing like a bunch of protected seeds and 5 and 6 seeds. So I think the matchup wasn't really all that favorable to Iowa here either. I just think that they really surprised the Gators at how slow and patient they were when they operated on offense. Iowa makes a few shots early, they get the lead. Florida digs a hole, and just it was a turnover out of bounds by Florida, and then a three by Fulgaris in the corner. It was just sort of a freak sequence at the end there. But that's what the tournament's about. If you leave the door open, you need to expect somebody to walk through it. And Iowa was able to get themselves into a situation at the end of the game where they had a shot to win it, and he knocked it down. But yeah, I think that's a game, Joe, where if it's played 10 times, I think Iowa wins one of them. And luckily for them, that was it. And they were able to get to the first Sweet 16 in 17 years, maybe more, but that's how long the
more.
previous
Yeah.
previous coach was there. He did not get to the Sweet 16. You'd have to go back to the Alford days, if I'm not mistaken, for a second weekend. And on that second weekend, Joe, they get a third visit. Well, not visit because they played in Texas, but a third meeting with their main rivals in the Big Ten, the Nebraska Cornhuskers. They had split the season series, like you said earlier, and it was the Hawkeyes that got the job done here, 77-71. Another incredibly patient offensive game for Iowa, and just like that, this 9 seed was in the Elite Eight.
Yeah, and one thing I'm curious for, if we get any Iowa viewers, please comment. We got some decent engagement on some of these videos already. Let me know what your favorite victory was, the Nebraska game in the Sweet 16 or the round of 32 one. I argue it might have been the Nebraska one. You play your
That was
biggest
their best
rival.
performance, I think, like all around.
I think so too. You play your biggest rival, a team that I think all three of those games show were incredibly
Yeah.
entertaining, incredibly close. I think the one in Nebraska went to overtime. I don't know if the one in Iowa City did. I don't
No,
believe
no,
so.
it was really close though. It was only 57 to
Yeah.
52.
Yeah, so three really entertaining games, and I think most people projected Nebraska to win that game. But I actually picked Iowa. I was very
Yeah.
convinced that their formula, they were a weird enough team. I think that's been the story on them the whole year. Being Sean said, this is going to be a weird enough team where they're going to piss some teams off. They're going to come really close to beating some teams, and they're going to get somebody eventually. Now, that eventually wasn't until Florida, but then they got Nebraska, and then you figure, oh my gosh, this could be one of the most improbable Final Four runs ever. Because yes, you have the George Masons, you have the Loyola Chicago's, and the NC State in 2024. But Sean, in terms of a team that, it wasn't necessarily through offensive firepower. Bennett Sturts, I think, is one of the better point guards we'll see for a while in Iowa history, let alone Big Ten. But it wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't like they were shooting lights out. It was just a very archaic formula, and it really frustrated teams.
The numbers show, which I'll go through in a second, don't really make a lot of sense. And well, they do make a lot of sense having watched Iowa all year, but they don't make sense in the fact that they were able to win 24 games and get to the Elite Eight. But not only did like the I think we talked about it going into the tournament, the Iowa formula was going to be a little different for these teams. Not for Nebraska. They've seen them twice before. So I didn't think that they'd be able to surprise them again, but they were just better in this one. They got better shots, and Nebraska, not matchup wise, probably not the best to exploit Iowa's weakness. Nebraska shoots a lot of threes. Iowa doesn't defend the rim. Great. So look, good shooting day for Iowa, bad shooting day for Nebraska. Iowa's through, where they faced another Big Ten opponent, Joe, this time Illinois. And if there's a team that knows how to match up hunt and get good 2 point looks, this year it was Illinois. And unfortunately for the Hawkeyes, it was too much. Illinois moved on to the Final Four, 71-59. But, Joe, what obviously a great start to the McCollum era here in Iowa City. It probably would have been a great start if they had lost in the round of 64, to be honest. But even you cap off a really solid season with a Elite Eight. I think going back to what you said earlier about the great Final Four runs, I think if these teams are wearing blue and white with the word Drake on their chest and they're an 11 seed, like it looks like this. Like they probably win a couple games too. And then about what you said about the engagement, I think the Iowa State of the Program football video is the highest viewed one in that series. So hoping we can get some of that on this one too. But at the end of the day, Joe, this team got to the Elite Eight this year. Probably not all season deserving of that, but they played well at the right time, especially when it didn't look like they were.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, Sean, this is the first Elite Eight in 39 years since 1987. So Coach McCollum's already broken a lot of barriers already. I don't know if I will hang a banner for the Elite Eight. I certainly don't know that, but I'll tell you, it's going to be pretty hard. Like the problem for Coach
Yeah, they,
McCollum
they
now is
might. They might.
but he might be a victim of his own success too,
Yeah.
going forward. Now, clearly, I'm not saying they're going to fire him or anything absurd like that, but that's a really high bar to clear, and he already did it in year one. So I think this conference, if you're a coach, you don't like Coach McCollum or Coach May. Nothing personally, maybe, but they're doing a really good job of making a lot of good coaches look somewhat underachieving, right? There's plenty of good coaches in this conference, Sean, that haven't been to an Elite Eight yet at their respective school. We'll get into Michigan in a later video, but these are two guys who immediately are proving in this conference with the right resources, the right formula, and to be quite frank, Sean, kind of like Dusty did with Vlad Golden, with the right like main staple from your old school, you could come in and get immediate results.
And looking at this roster, Joe, I think it's one that we're gonna look back on and say he took this team to the Elite Eight. Like no offense to them, but Bennett Sturt's unicorn, clearly the most valuable player to his team in the country. He never really came off the floor. I think they had to go back. He played 40 minutes almost every game. 94% of the minutes he was on the floor, and that's including garbage time against the bye games early in the season. They did actually have a little bit of retention. Cooper Koch was there. Tate Sage was a recruit that he kept. And then he brought over Tavion Banks. I believe he was from Drake, yes. And then Manyawu also was from Drake. So he had his nucleus from that Drake team that did go to the round of 32 last year. But he also did hit on a couple of transfers here. He had Fulgaris, who came over from Robert Morris. And look, he wasn't great this year. Definitely underachieved, but man, no Iowa fan is going to remember that in 10 years because of the three-pointer that he had against Florida. But looking at this roster, Joe, I think making the tournament would have been an accomplishment. And I think there's a chance that this might be the least talented team that Ben McCollum has at Iowa.
Yeah, and now in terms of results, I bet it's one of the better ones he'll end up
Yes,
having there
Elite Eight, yes.
just because of the absurdity of it. But in terms of where they go next, Sean, it's really interesting because Bennett Sturts has been a main staple of the McCollum,
Yeah.
the
What?
last two McCollum teams. He's gone. Uh, but I think their style of play. The biggest question this offseason I have isn't even on Iowa. It's, are the Big Ten coaches going to figure this out, right? Because even the games, like Iowa, one thing that impressed me, aside from Michigan State and that Purdue game at home shot, they didn't really get blown out, right? They were close in every game they were in.
Yeah, so here's the numbers that doesn't make sense if you just watched Iowa a few times, right? We talked about their snail pace, one of the slowest in the country. But I don't think they were ever really taking the air out of the ball. I think they were just really patient, and they got a ton of good shots at the end of the clock. Um, they were the 16th most efficient offense in the country per Torvik, 38th on defense. They didn't turn over the ball. They turned over the other team a lot. And despite giving up a lot of fouls and not rebounding particularly well, they continued to be efficient with the turnovers. They were 16th best in 2-point field goal percentage. They were great from the free throw line. None of these stats, well, none of these are bad enough really to show any like major red flags. They weren't great at 2-point defense, 54.3%, but they were great in free throw percentage defense, which means you're fouling the right people. That's a little more luck than nothing, right? Because a center who stinks at free throws could go 8 for 8 on the day, and that's 100%. But they were able to mask, I think, some real flaws that coaches were not really able to get at enough. This team was one of the worst in the country at 2-point defense, and only a couple of times did that really matter.
Yeah. And Sean, I will say maybe with you might call their draw a little lucky, though I
Of
think beating
course.
Florida doesn't entail much luck. But one thing we didn't mention about that Illinois game shot, they were right there with 4 minutes left in the game. That under four, they're only down, I think, 3 or 4 points. And for a lot of that second half, they were hitting shots to take the lead. So I think now that you have hopefully a nucleus of players returning and guys recruited, and especially that coaching staff you're bringing back, they know what it takes to get there. Now, I guess the proof is it's not theoretical. They've done it. Now can they sustain success, right? For all the people calling McCollum, the Kurt Signetti or whatever, we don't have to go into all that. The one thing Kurt Signetti did is he upgraded that roster, upgraded his philosophy, and that had raised expectations year two. Now, I'm not telling you Iowa has to win the national title next year or do anything absurd, but can he do that? Can this team be more consistent? And Sean, the one thing I'll critique about their season, can they maybe pull off more than one upset against a
Yep.
Nebraska, right? Can they get the Michigans? Can they get the Michigan States who both Michigan State they'll have at home next year and they'll have Indiana, I believe, at home next year, right, Sean? So
At
uh
least, yeah. Unless they play twice,
yeah.
which means they'll at least have them at home. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my one question for Iowa going into next year. Can they sustain this in the regular season? And can they, actually knock off one of these top dogs, right?
Another thing, Joe, that didn't really stick out to me is tempo, right? They weren't very fast. They still blew out a lot of these bye games, right? They still got their number to cover, which put them in a great spot metrics wise. They were like top 20 in the net for most of the season, but despite having some really low possession games, like they were incredibly efficient offensively. Like they had 94 points against Bucknell in 65 possessions, 91 against Western Michigan in 64. So the scores might be a little bit deceiving here for Iowa because, as Torvik shows here, you can see the possessions, right? Pretty much around 60 most of the time. Look, sometimes there's a few more in close games where there's fouls, but I would say for the most part, especially towards the latter half of the Big Ten, it's probably averaging a little bit more than 60. So if you're getting to 75 to 80 points in those games offensively, like that's an incredibly efficient day, um, which is what they did, fairly often here, even in some of their losses. So obviously the main question is what is this offense, what does this system look like without Bennett Sturts? I did show the transfer portal stuff real quick there, Joe. Fulgaris and Banks are in the transfer portal, have not committed to their new place yet. Fulgaris is probably going to Louisville. And then they have brought in one transfer, Andrew McKeever, a 7'2", 7'1" center from St. Mary's. That is not something they had this year. Fulgaris was the height, at 6'10", and he was more of a 3 than a 5. Man Yao was 6'9", played a lot of minutes at the 5. But they're going to have a pure center next year. That is not something they had this time around.
Yeah, and the question with Andrew McKeever, right, I think had good production at St. Mary's, but the drop off was there. That's been a criticism of him as a player in the portal against high majors. Can Coach McCollum coach him up? Can they maybe get his weight up too? I think Iowa, with that system having a post presence and a rim denier, if he could become that or evolve into one quickly, that could be a nightmare for Big Ten teams. The teams that pick them apart or beat them flat out without too much trouble, I'd say, even though Michigan didn't play too well, was Michigan, who kind of at will got what they wanted with the Daimara, and Purdue. And to an extent, Michigan State, right? They
Yeah,
had
just
Kohler and Cooper.
pure back to the basket fives. And I don't know if
Yeah.
McKeever is really that, because offensively the Iowa 5 needs to be like a short roller, lob threat. I think McKeever might, like, he's not a guy you just dump it into the post and let him work. I think he can move a little bit and act as like a mover and a blocker rather than a like post up. But he's also like really tall, and if he gets his weight up, like you said, he should be able to guard like the straight post up a little better than they were this year, and that should help the 2 point percentage.
Yep. I completely agree.
So in terms of other people on the roster, Joe, Sage and Koch will be back, I'd assume, and then Combs as well has another year of eligibility. And then look, you're getting probably to some people that have not decided where they're going yet. But as we wrap up this season, Joe, we do take expectations, everything in mind. Let's give a grade to Iowa this season.
Yeah, Sean, my grade for the Iowa Hawkeyes is actually an A+. I think that's the first one I've given out so far.
Yep, me too.
Uh, Completely exceeded expectations. And people say, well, you criticize the regular season. Well, damn it, they made up for it in the actual tournament, and that's what we're going to grade a lot of teams on.
I think Joe, a round of 32 appearance would have been an A+ for me. Like we have to remember that this is his first year with like one player who's played like real like Power 5 minutes, and they did bring in Brendan Hawson. He um didn't really play a whole lot. He was injured. But like a couple of bench minutes for Koch was it when it comes to Power 5 experience. There's another team that we have talked about already that didn't have a lot of Power 5 experience, and it cost them in the end. Can't really say the same here for Iowa, as they were able to get 24 wins in Elite 8 appearance. I think it'd be ridiculous to do anything other than A+, Joe. This team got to the tournament. I think that probably is deserving of something that starts with an A. And then winning a tournament game probably gets them to an A+, to be honest. And obviously they did three of that. They did that 3 times. But yeah, expectation matters when grading here, and I think it's fair to give them an A+. But going forward, obviously, a number of we already touched on it a little bit, but the state of the program I think is pretty solid in terms of their resources. They're definitely not at the top of the pack in the Big Ten. I would say probably around the middle, maybe slightly below the middle. But look, if there's somebody who can get a lesser talent to an equal playing field, it's Ben McCollum.
Yep.
So, Joe, unless you got anything else to add, I think we'll wrap it up here.
No, Sean, I think overachievement for Iowa, and we'll see what happens in year two.
All right, well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Please check out the other ones if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.